Let's go ahead and get started, y'all. Today should be a fairly short lecture, so y'all can go home and get your weekend started a little bit early, hopefully. As always, we'll go through our typical, announcements and everything, just so y'all can stay on top of things. One thing I did want to bring to your attention that's not up here is that the Monday before Thanksgiving, more than likely, we will not have class that day. I'm trying to see if I can squeeze 2 lectures into one real quick so we can move the disease ecology lecture to next Friday. And so that way y'all can not have to be here for that full week of Thanksgiving. Because I don't know about y'all, but I don't want to be here right now. Let's be real here. I don't understand why it's UCF in particular drives me nuts because a lot of schools take that whole week off for, and for whatever reason UCF does it. So go figure. But yeah, you already have that Wednesday off, so it would just be like just trying to like move things around a little bit because that disease ecology lecture is pretty cool, and I don't want to lose it. So, all right. As always, quiz 12 is due on Sunday, November 15th at 11:59 p.m. There's only 2 more of these, so please, please, please use this as an opportunity to do better and get your quiz averages higher. A lot more of these quizzes are going to be a little bit more straightforward. It's kind of like, honestly, I think this is probably the easiest unit because it's a lot of like, what disease did Matt study in XYZ example, which is pretty easy compared to what is a very minute detailed thing about a particular bone structure or something like that. So take advantage of those opportunities. Don't just say, screw it, I'm done. Also, don't forget that Connecting with Biology 3 is due on the 1st. I've seen a lot of you already do it, which is great. If you're having trouble finding an animal for it, let me know. I'm happy to kind of point you in certain directions. For instance, there's that Coop restaurant that's like right outside here in Oviedo. They have this huge pond there that you can always see a bunch of like flat-shelled turtles there. Go out there, watch them for 10 minutes, get it knocked out, and be done. Of course, obviously, there's squirrels on campus. There's lizards on campus, a lot of fun stuff. Yeah. So what will happen, what you need to do is it's a 2-step process, unfortunately. So you're going to go out and you're going to do that Google form. And I also recommend writing this down because I can send it to you afterwards, but it's a process. Basically, what you need to do is go out, observe the animal, and follow the submission that I sent where it shows you, okay, here's the specific organism. I observed it clearly because I have the iNaturalist record from it, the day, the time, all that kind of crap. That little box that I showed y'all, and then you submit as well online. So it's a 2-part process, unfortunately. But it's just so that way I can have something physically to show that you turned it in correctly. Because sometimes it's really easy with that Google Forms process for things to just kind of get buried. So you have to do it both ways. Trust me, it'll give you a lot less stress. Just because it's not going to be like, oh, why do I have a 0 on this, that kind of thing. But you turned it in and did everything the right way. As well as, don't forget the final exam is due on December 10th. Again, I think it's at 10 a.m. So we'll do like 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. I highly doubt you'll need that much time. Again, it's going to be another 40-question test. That's just on this unit, so it'll be easy, relatively speaking. It's not cumulative, none of that BS. So it should be a little bit better. I'm sorry, I hate cumulative tests, especially in a class like this that just jumps around too much. And finally, with that being said, you have the extra credit opportunity. Yeah, it's a little bit more work, but I'm rewarding y'all with a little bit more points too. So if you get, say, an 80% and you do the extra credit, you now have an A, right? 10 points, percentage points, not like, question points. So don't stress out about that too much. I've already had like 3 people finish it and do it, and they've been pretty good so far. So let's try to keep up that momentum. It does look good so far. And what I'm hoping to do is basically treat this as all of y'all are going to be basically authors in a little miniature book that I'm going to send out at the end of the semester. That's like, here's all the vertebrates we found on campus and all the cool things that we found. So it'll be kind of cute. And, maybe people down the road could potentially use it. So try to put at least a little bit of effort into it, okay? All right. Any more administrative questions? Perfect. So let's go ahead and get started here, if my computer will cooperate. So today we're going to be kind of continuing on with that theme of populations and communities and ecosystems, and we're going to be delving more into the community side of things, moving away from individual specific populations to what's happening in the rest of the ecosystem. Now, as we kind of mentioned before, a community is a group of interacting populations. So you have the population of all the trees in a particular area, the population of the animals that use that thing. So for instance, in this Flora Explorer community, that includes everything from the plants, the fungi, as well as many of the unseen animals and microbes. Remember, a lot of that stuff can be microscopic, but just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there, it doesn't have a major role. Things like nitrogen-fixing bacteria can drive an entire ecosystem, and you could never know they were there. In fact, we didn't know for a long time. And each species interacts with another species in the community. These are called biotic interactions. Anytime that they're interacting with each other. It could be predation, it could be symbiosis, where they're actually benefiting each other mutually, or it could be something where one is just getting lucky and the other one's just kind of there happening to hang out. Just kind of depends. And we'll get into a lot of those individual specific relationships here in a second. The communities obviously interact with their surroundings. So we do have that ecosystem component where they're incorporating that abiotic factor, the soil, the hydro period, crazy things like the amount of rain, all that kind of stuff, all factors in. Think, for instance, when we're talking about the Southeast, probably the most important thing that we often mention when we're talking about the kinds of communities that we have, the kinds of ecosystems we have, is fire. Fire plays such a strong dominating role, but it's that abiotic part of that ecosystem, right? It's not living, it's not controlled per se. Now, these ecosystems rely on both those biotic and abiotic interactions. For instance, you need, that tree to send out all of its seeds so that way some of the birds and, small mammals can eat them. But that way you have all that kind of interaction. But you also need those abiotic ones. That tree needs to be able to be planted in a certain kind of soil. That soil maybe, need those nitrogen-fixing bacteria to kind of get some of those like forbs and grasses and things to grow up underneath, that sort of thing. So these three ecosystems below here include plants that absorb inorganic nutrients, things that are coming out of the soil or coming out of the sand and the water here, as well as harvesting energy from the sun. So for instance, you've got all these different plants here, the saguaro cactus, some of those aquatic vegetation, that sort of stuff. Obviously, you have an animal that will eat that plant, as well as decomposers that are going to return inorganic nutrients back to the soil. Everything is connected, everything has its place, but it's not necessarily manufactured that way. It's just kind of all these things have evolved to fit a very specific place and time. And so as you change things, it makes it a little bit more complicated. It can get very interesting very quickly. Now, more often than not, artificial ecosystems are often in balance. So say, for instance, in controlled animal feeding operations, while they're extremely useful for keeping human populations around and do have a benefit in that regard, they're extremely high density because they're often bringing in imported food into those situations. It's not like the animals are just consuming what's already there. And since there are no plants, that food is brought in from outside, and these animals release immense volumes of that organic waste, because obviously that has to go somewhere, right? And as a result, you have often too much for the local decomposers to handle, and you have to either ship it off or find ways to dispose of it. And that can be beneficial and that cannot be. It just kind of depends on the situation, how the farm sets it up. Everything from your typical cow poop can be pretty useful in things like fertilizers, but you have to be able to find where you can make sure you're not poisoning everybody, as well as finding that nice balance between what works and what doesn't. Now, something we've kind of already been alluding to, but each species in this community has a unique niche, and that niche is its place. It's specific area of time and space and resources that organism has evolved to fit at some point in time. And I joke about the stupid pandas, but pandas are stupid. They have a very weird niche that shouldn't exist, and more often than not is going to probably drive them to extinction because it's such a shitty little niche that doesn't work in today's modern era. Those ecological traps can come out as a result of it. So a niche in this case is a total of all the resources that a species requires for its survival, growth, and reproduction, and the habitat is just one part of that niche. Because it's not just where it lives, but what it's consuming, how it's interacting with the environment, all that kind of fun stuff. And this can get very complicated very quickly. So there are a lot of organisms that have very wide-spreading kind of life histories. Things like frogs, for instance, right? They have that terrestrial state where they live as adults, but they also have that aquatic state where they need those ponds and things to be perfect for them. So obviously that kind of gets more complicated, especially if you want to preserve what kind of frog. You need to preserve the water and the land, right? It gets even more complicated when you start factoring in species that move great distances. Anadromous and catadromous fishes, cannot speak today, are types of fish that either move from freshwater to saltwater or saltwater to freshwater. You got to have unimpeded dams for that to work, right? How many of y'all have ever seen a salmon gun? Probably just fishing. It's literally just a giant pipe with high pressured water that they shoot salmon through because they can't get past the dam on their own. Really cool, entertaining to watch. But because they've evolved with that very specific niche that utilizes the Pacific Northwest in its entirety, where they're going from these very high elevation mountain streams all the way down into the coastal waters, if you have things that are blocking that impediment, that niche no longer works for them. Now, the interactions in an ecosystem are selective forces. So as we've kind of been talking with evolution, you have to be shaped and molded to fit into a particular place. So, predator pressure, the availability of resources from your own food perspective, all of that kind of stuff can kind of shape how an organism will fit into its niche and what kind of niche it wants to occupy. Now, adaptations originate in that genetic variability that we talked about, as well as with the behavior stuff. We talked about how culture and other things can also implement that evolutionary advantage. All right, so let's do a quick review question here. Which of the following is an example of an ecological community? Give me a couple seconds. All right. What about answer B? Is that an ecological community? What is it? Population, right? What about C? Same deal, right? It's population too. What about B? Still a population, so it must be A, right? Plain and simple. So even though on the surface it doesn't seem like an actual habitat, right? You're talking about the intestines of a human with all the bacterial cells and all that stuff in it. That's still a habitat for something, right? Weird to think of our bodies as a habitat, but it is what it is, and it's an ecosystem. Now, obviously, the Earth has incredible differences in climate, as well as prevailing long-term weather patterns in general, that across the Earth result in a wide variety of ecosystems. Everything from the massive glaciers that occur in the Arctic and the Antarctic, the more temperate areas that are usually just as kind of like shadows of the mountains themselves, where they usually get a decent amount of rain, but it's still high elevation, so the trees just don't grow as well there. To the massive, beautiful rainforests of Central and South America, as well as Central Africa and parts of Southeast Asia. And finally, the incredible deserts, which may be apparently devoid of life, but they have an incredible wide variety of organisms that evolved to fit that area and take advantage of its resources. Now, ultimately, the Earth's curvature has a lot to do with this kind of differences in climates. We have this uneven distribution of sunlight across the Earth's surface, which explains why temperature falls from the distance from the equator. So obviously, the more north you are, the more south you are, you're going to be further away from the sun's rays. And as a result, you're just not going to get as much light. And without that light, you don't get it as warm as other places. And because you have this tilted axis, that's what gives us the seasons, right? And that's why things like the southern areas, so Australia, Antarctica, that sort of thing, have an entirely different set of seasons than we do. So our winter is their summer, that kind of thing. Ultimately, Earth is warmest at the equator and coolest at the poles. So I'm sure, as you've noticed, as you go farther south in Florida and going towards the Caribbean, it stays warmer, it stays more humid. That's all just part of being near the equator. And again, that tilted axis really influences stuff as well. So that tilt of the Earth's axis is going to produce those distinct seasons in the northern and southern hemispheres as the Earth travels around the sun, and as the sun is reflecting light onto the Earth, that's going to heavily influence how things work. Again, that's what's creating that seasonality. And seasonality especially can influence things incredibly. Even here in Florida, where the seasons don't really change all that much, there's still a big noticeable difference between August, when you're sweating your ass off walking around campus, to right now where it's beautiful. That's just a simple 20-degree variation in Fahrenheit. So next to nothing. We don't get the snows and the freezing cold of somewhere like Rochester, New York. That's still really fascinating how all these little things can change. And I'm sure y'all have noticed it too, but obviously the days are shorter now, right? We went from being able to have sunlight from 8 a.m. till 9 p.m. to somewhere around 8 a.m. till 5:30 p.m. And that makes a massive difference in when organisms are going to come out and try to interact with their environment, all that kind of fun stuff too. And finally, you get to these air circulation patterns that are going to heavily influence this. So I explain why some areas of Earth might be more moist while other areas are much more dry. So warm water is going to evaporate near the equator, rise, form clouds, and then those water is going to cool and be released back as rain over those tropical latitudes. That's usually what gets you those tropical storms, that constant convection of those air currents moving around. And that's what can also form things like deserts. Because you have, after releasing all this water over tropical rainforests, all that dry air is going to move further away from the equator. And that's where you get things like the Sahara, the Gobi Desert, the Sonoran and the Chiricahua deserts, all that kind of fun stuff. Although keep in mind too that some of the more local land features also plays a large role in this as well. Now finally, oceans can affect, ocean currents specifically can affect the climate. For instance, way up here in Great Britain, they can often be able to handle things like palm trees, even though the actual weather is pretty shitty. And the reason for that is you have this warm water current coming up through here along our coast, all the way over here. So for instance, if you've ever sat there and watched a lot of the hurricane tracks, you'll see that they do that kind of pattern quite frequently. And what they're doing is they're following that Gulf Stream through the Atlantic and out towards the islands of Ireland and the UK. And finally, we'll get to some of those more local features, things like mountains and rivers, where they have higher elevation or lower elevation. And as a result, it kind of changes how that weather is going to interact with that very specific area. This is actually really interesting. One of the places that I had the privilege to work in is in the deserts of Arizona and New Mexico. And basically what happens is in those really high elevation areas, the rain cloud will hit them. They'll just dump for like an hour and a half and completely deplete themselves. And what it does is it creates these massive monsoon rain floods that'll come from the top of the mountains and just race down. And so they don't ever perpetually hold water in these little areas that almost look like rivers when they're completely full, but they disappear within the next day. It's crazy to see. And in fact, people get killed in them a lot of times because you're out here hiking around, it's sunny, nothing is raining near you, but then you have a massive flood coming from way up in the higher mountain elevations. Nearly got killed in one of these myself, actually. Yeah. Let's do another quick review question here. So you've got deserts that form at the 30 degrees north and south of the equator. Why is that? Because that's where they are. Makes the most sense. Are the soils the richest? Potentially. We don't know. It's a relatively small planet. What about temperatures? Where are they actually the warmest at? Yeah, equator. So it's not the temperature part. Is the Earth closest to the sun? No. That's the equator, right? Probably Earth receives the most sunlight. Guess what? The equator. So it clearly has more to do with that rainfall being scarce, right? So that the answer would be B. Now, as a result of all these climatic variations, it creates these things called biomes, which are ecosystems with a very distinct community of life. The ecologists have divided this biosphere into biomes, and each biome is characterized by a distinctive group of species. For instance, forest, desert, and grassland are all examples of terrestrial biomes, where you have lakes, streams, and oceans that are all based on water, where each one has very different characteristics, whether it be flow rates, whether it be depth, all that kind of fun stuff can dramatically impact how an environment's going to be shaped. And ultimately, that physical environment dictates where each species can live. Things like, energy source availability. So if you're a plant, you obviously need to be able to, one, get your nutrients from somewhere, and two, you need to be able to have access to the sun, right? So probably not going to do well in a place that's super cloudy and shaded over. Things like temperature, things like moisture in the soil, which is moisture in general. Things like nutrients, that's all that kind of fun stuff is just that really strong abiotic structure that's going to shape what kind of communities can form in a certain area. Now, ultimately, when you're talking about the terrestrial biomes, a lot of that has to do with what kinds of plants are there. So the types and community structure of plants is going to determine what kind of biomes we kind of classify things into. So Earth's climatic zones typically support characteristic types of vegetation, which correspond with 10 basic different terrestrial biomes. Plants which form the basis of the food web influence which other organisms can also live in each area. So just some classic examples: tundra, temperate grasslands, savanna, temperate forest, tropical dry forest, tropical rainforest, temperate rainforest, which I'm sure most of y'all have never heard of before, All that kind of fun stuff gets factored in. And again, there are a wide variety of these terrestrial biomes. And all of it has to do with the soils, the water, all that kind of fun stuff that factors into what an organism can live in that particular environment. Now, humans have dramatically reduced many of these natural biomes. For instance, the longleaf pine ecosystem that we associate with the Southeast is very fire tolerant to all these things. Between logging and the lack of fire, we've gone from 100% of it in the 1600s to 3%. It's a massive decrease in the amount of just hectares of things throughout the entire country, which is just stunning to think about. So here you can actually see the range of each terrestrial biome as it originally was, supposedly prior to humans. But keep in mind too, more than likely this does include some human interaction, because obviously humans have been on this earth for about 1 million years. So there are some, even if it's not Homo sapiens, there's at least some sort of Homo species that has kind of affected some of this stuff. In fact, it's been argued that a lot of the reason why we have such strong dominant grasslands in Central and Southern Africa is because of fire and humans learning how to use fire, which can be both good and bad, depends on the situation. Then you have those aquatic biomes, which kind of include things like freshwater versus oceans, the actual topography underneath, all that kind of fun stuff. So water is obviously continuously moving around the ocean, the atmosphere, the land, the surfaces, and all that kind of fun stuff, providing those vital connections among all of those different biomes. Obviously, there's a big difference between a rainforest and a desert, and all that's being driven by how much water is present. Now, most of the Earth's water is in the ocean. So if you were to actually like draw it out here, here's all the water in the ocean, this giant, massive pool. You've got 2% of it that goes into the ice caps and the glaciers. The amount of surface water, so your rivers, lakes, and all that kind of fun stuff, could fit in an algae. All the groundwater could fit in this rain barrel, so about 50 gallons or so. And then finally, a single gallon of water, all that soil and atmospheric water. So for context, that is a massive difference, right? And obviously, things like the glaciers and the polar ice sheets are going to tie up 2/3 of our fresh water, whereas most of the rest is going to be groundwater, soil, and the atmosphere. So very, very little of the fresh water on the Earth is present in that surface water condition, in those lakes, those ponds, all that kind of thing, which is kind of incredible to think about, especially in regards to us living in Florida, where we see all this water all the time. So another quick review question here. Which biome is not matched with the abiotic factors that limit which species can survive? So we'll talk through these things. I don't expect you all to know yet. So taiga, low temperature. That's correct. The taiga is kind of the in-between between the Arctic Circle and places like that temperate rainforest that we talked about in Spokane, Washington, or something like that. That taiga is going to be most of your kind of like cold polar grasslands that you're going to see in Siberia and Russia, or as well as like Alaska, the northern part of Canada, that sort of thing. Temperate grasslands, drought and fire. That's pretty regular, right? That's what we're in technically. You're going to get a lot of water that'll be really prevalent and water that won't be. But fire is a huge dominating structure for that. Desert and lack of moisture, that one should be pretty straightforward. Tundra and frozen soil, that's what actually classifies it separately from that taiga, as you actually have that permafrost that exists to some level. And finally, all the above are matched correctly. So in this case, yes, all of them have been matched correctly. Here's another quick one here. Why do estuaries have such high primary product production? I think this question is a little bit unfair to be giving y'all here, but we'll talk through it. So an estuary is a situation where you've got the intermingling between saltwater and freshwater, where you've got that interaction between everything. It's where you're getting all those nutrients and things that may have been started way up in the mountains somewhere, came down through the rivers, and ultimately ended up at that big basin. And if you look at things like the Mississippi River, when they come into the Atlantic, you just see this massive cloud of dirt and nutrients and a lot of other things coming into the ocean, and you can actually see it from space. It's really cool. So part of it, yes, is the changing salinity of water. Is, yeah, that does have an impact of what kind of organisms can be there, but that's not really what's driving that high productivity value. B, the producers in the estuaries receive nutrients from the land at tides. That is true. But the big deal here is that C, absence of the consumers that eat the producers. So basically you have consumers that just aren't nearly as strong through here. The producers are just going to have massive production through there. So in this case, C, the answer is correct. Honestly, this question kind of sucks, so don't expect to see this one again. Now, these community interactions occur within each biome. You have things like competition, where both species are negatively affected. Things like symbiosis, where you have mutualisms, where both species can be positively benefited. The classic example of this is anemones and clownfish, right? You've got the anemone that benefits from that clownfish defecating and bringing resources to that anemone, and you have the clownfish that benefits from the anemone because it's being provided protection. Things like commensalism, where one species will benefit, but the other species is not negatively affected. Things like parasitism, which almost acts like being eaten because one is benefiting, the other one's being negatively harmed. Herbivory, which is very similar, one is being benefited, the other one's negatively harmed. And finally, predation, same situation. These interactions can have various levels of effects on the survival and reproductive success of the participants. Obviously, if it's just a little bit, it's not just cut and dry, yes, it's positive or yes, it's negative. Often this occurs on a gradient, where it can be a slight negative thing that might hamper reproductive success just slightly, but it's enough that it's still technically a negative effect on that plant or that animal. Now, obviously, these niches that we've been talking about aren't very well defined by in all circumstances. And there may be certain organisms that can take advantage of that same niche. So as a result, you often will see various species fighting over the same thing. So these birds, for instance, are fighting over an apple that dropped off the tree. Two different species trying to compete for that same resource, that same niche, right? And since neither obtains all the apple that it needs, the effects of competition are usually negative for both. Now, periodically, you will see situations where a particular species can completely outcompete the other one and remove it from the landscape, but that's not always the case because the landscape and the things that can affect it are constantly changing. And so when you might have had an established ecosystem where that particular organism has taken over that niche, something might change everything back up again. Now, ultimately, two species cannot coexist indefinitely in the same exact niche without change in that niche itself. The zebra mussels have displaced a lot of native species through competitive exclusion principle. In other words, they're so much better at outcompeting the native species that they're completely excluding them out of that habitat now. As a result, it's because they've acquired more resources while the other less successful species have died out. And ultimately, what was once a thriving community of like 30 different kinds of mussel species is now just all taken over by these stupid trash things. Now, competition as well can result in this resource partitioning. So an organism that's more generalistic, but it competes specifically in one area really well, may be able to focus on that, while another organism that's more generalistic but does better in resource B can actually do better on resource B. And as a result, even though both of them can utilize both resources A and B, one's going to specialize on A and the other one's going to specialize on B. So sometimes with these multiple species, you have similar requirements that can coexist in the same habitat. For instance, these penguins, for example, inhabit the southern Indian Ocean. And researchers have found that the species can feed at different times or locations, which reduces that competition. So you have the eastern rockhoppers versus the northern rockhoppers. They're coming out, they're feeding at different times off different islands, and as a result, even though they're feeding on the exact same thing, that temporal element is allowing them to use it at different times. And as a result, they can still compete and live in the same place. Now, symbiotic interactions can both benefit or harm the species. So remember, symbiosis and mutualism aren't the same thing. Mutualism is when you have both of them both benefiting. Symbiosis is any interaction. So these symbiotic relationships occur where two species share a close and often lifelong relationship, in which when one typically lives in or around another. So there's three primary types of symbiotic relationship. You can have mutualism, which is where both parties benefit. Commensalism, which is where one party benefits and the other one's just kind of there. It's not really being harmed. And finally, parasitism, which acts more like predation or herbivory, where one is being positively benefited and the other one's being negatively benefited. Now, herbivory, words today. Herbivory and predation link species and feeding relationships. So all animals must obtain energy and nutrients from somewhere, right? So they're either getting it from dead or living organisms, or they're like a plant that can absorb it from the sun. So for instance, this caterpillar is a herbivore. because it consumes plants. The predator, that is an animal that kills and eats other animals, like this caterpillar, is called a predator, obviously, and so the caterpillar would be considered prey. A lot of this stuff is pretty straightforward. Y'all should know this vocabulary by now. Now, plant and prey items have been adapting to avoid being eaten. Things like these really beautiful colors that tell, hey, stay away, I'm poisonous. Or this incredible mimicry, so it looks like something that's not. Or even situations like this, where it's camouflage into the environment. All three of these different techniques allow for that prey item to kind of blend in a little bit better. And so even something like this dart frog, which is big, bright mouth, it's telling things to leave it alone. Now, ultimately, predators have to defeat a prey defense, right? They have to be able to eat somehow. And so you can see things like cooperation, which is where they go out and hunt in groups as a behavioral adaptation of predators to be able to take down larger prey that they wouldn't have been able to handle by themselves. Things like, by working together, this pack of wolves can then bring down an elk that is almost 2 to 3 times its size. That entire pack can eat instead of just having one individual starve because it can't bring down that larger prey item by itself. So this kind of brings up something called the Red Queen hypothesis, where ultimately a predator and a prey item are going to be continuously evolving to either try to catch that prey item or to be evading that predator constantly. And so in other words, you're always just running in a circle without actually getting anywhere. It's a really cool concept, and it's also very useful in disease ecology as well. Ultimately, you're constantly evolving, even though it doesn't necessarily look like it. Now, closely interacting species may co-evolve together and form really strong relationships that basically cause these animals to be reliant on each other to continue to exist. So this can be called, in this situation, it's called coevolution. For instance, these crossbill birds eat the seeds of the pine tree, selecting for the pine cones with the thick protective scales, and in turn, the sturdy pine cones select for birds that are kind of larger, stronger bills. Each one is applying evolutionary pressure on each other, and ultimately they're kind of growing together. Same kind of things happen with things like that clownfish and the anemone example, where constantly these organisms are kind of evolving to fit into that same niche. You can even see really extreme examples where some of like the African acacia trees will develop these little seed pods that are lacking of seeds, that all they do is produce a little nectar that is used to feed ants. And so those ants have then evolved to go and protect the tree from things like giraffes and elands and that kind of stuff. So that way they're not getting, consumed. And it's a really cool, fascinating relationship that took millions of years to evolve, and it's all kind of a stepping stone process to get to that point. But when you just have the final picture to look at, it's incredible. Now, one really important group that we want to talk about is something called the keystone species. So if you've ever seen an arch, right, you have that little piece at the top called the keystone. And the reason why an arch is able to stand and not just topple over is that keystone takes all the weight and pressure of that arch and holds it together. Well, like that arch, the keystone species is something that's going to hold that entire community together, do something that provides habitat or food or something like that, that dramatically shapes that entire ecosystem. How many of y'all have ever done Flight of Passage in Animal Kingdom? Yeah, so y'all have probably heard a very similar spiel about, as you're sitting there waiting to get on the stupid bike, they talk about what a keystone species is, and they give some really terrible examples of it, but still, it's talking about these things and how they matter. So here in the Pacific Northwest, you have an example with these sea otters. Now, sea otters are a keystone species in the Pacific Northwest because they like to eat these kelp-eating sea urchins. And so by keeping these urchin populations down, it allows these kelp to massively reproduce and grow huge. And as a result, we have hundreds of different fish species, as well as a lot of other different invertebrates that take advantage of those massive kelp forests. So in order to, once that kelp flourishes and provides home for all these other different species, if you remove the sea otters, all that's gone. In fact, we've recently learned about this because, up through about the 1970s, it was totally legal to hunt these things for fur because it's really nice fur. But when you completely wipe out the sea otter population, everything else dies too. Another great example of this is how many of y'all know that the absolute worst book that he thought he ever wrote, Peter Benchley thought that Jaws was the worst thing he ever put into the public. And the reason why is because after the movie Jaws, and after the book Jaws, people went out and just started indiscriminately slaughtering every shark they saw. And as a result, you saw massive collapses in entire ecosystems as a direct result, because they lost that top predator that controlled the more middle-sized predators. And when those populations ballooned, it killed everything below, and then the middle predators died off. Now, here in Florida, we have a really cool example of this that many of you have probably seen. It's the gopher tortoise. These cute little tortoises, which can kill each other too, they give you really amazing burrows. They can be upwards of 30 to 40 feet long and can house well over 400 different species of organisms. Now, what's really important about these burrows is when you light a match to this forest type, everything goes in the damn burrow and gets protected. It's safe. By having these gopher tortoises in that ecosystem, you're building a refuge for all those animals to be able to get out of the way of the fire and come back out once the fire's swept through. Everything has a place. All right, let's do another quick review question here. Which of these interactions are beneficial to one species but harmful to another? We'll go through all of them that apply. Herbivory, does it fit this example? Positive one, negative the other, right? Perfect. Mutualism. No. What is it? Positive and positive, right? Parasitism. Positive and negative, good. Competition. Negative, negative, right? So that one doesn't count. Predation. Positive, negative, right? Perfect. And finally, commensalism. What is that one? Exactly. So in this case, the three that we would pick out would be herbivory, parasitism, and predation. Pretty straightforward, right? Now, we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but in order to like quantify how these organisms or how these communities are structured, we need to be able to quantify what kinds of organisms are living here, how many of them, all that kind of stuff. So we factor in things like species richness, which is the total number of species that occupy a habitat. I'm sure y'all have seen a little bit of this based off of the high naturalist examples that we were talking about earlier, as well as the community. For instance, here the community in yellow has the lowest richness than any other community here in blue. To see how it's got just dramatically lower, pretty much everything is just, you have some diversity, but it's all pretty much there. And diversity is also measured through evenness. So not only how many organisms, or sorry, not only how many species are occupying the area, but how evenly do they fit into that area. Now, ultimately, a more diverse area is going to be something that looks like this, where you've got a bunch of different species all equally sharing that habitat. That usually will never happen. Or this lowest diversity example where you have still the same number of species, but one is completely dominating everything else. This can have some pretty dramatic consequences. So this is actually something from the work that I'm doing where we were looking at the prevalence of a disease over here on the y-axis versus a bunch of different portions. So the amount of random frogs, things like bullfrogs, leopard frogs that were in a community, the amount of hylids, which are all your tree frogs, your overall things like crayfish, which can surprisingly affect disease, which in frogs are consistent, and then that chain of diversity, which is that combined evenness and richness metric that we talked about the other day. And what you can see is even though something like chain of diversity index would be usually considered to be beneficial, right? You want that really high diversity. Notice as we increase our chain of diversity index, prevalence increases. So it's not always perfect. And ultimately, what we think is happening here is because we have more hosts that can all more equally hold that pathogen is able to spread and do well in that environment, compared to something where it's only one species or two species, and as a result, they just don't do as well. So here's a great example of this. So imagine that the different shapes represent different species. Which community has both the lowest species richness and the lowest species evenness? How many of y'all think it's A? B? Good. C? B. Yeah. It's B, right? You've got two species and they're very, very unevenly distributed. Which again, that's actually pretty regularly going to happen. Now, the last thing we're going to touch on here is something called succession. Now, succession is a gradual change in the community species composition at the time. Now, keep in mind, some of how we view this has changed a lot in the last 100 years. Because we have, up until this point, remember, we kind of, through the 1900s, really back to the 1800s, we kind of clear cut a lot of areas and just let everything grow back. So what we think is kind of this climax, the ultimate community, if you will, that's going to result of all these different areas. What we're kind of missing is that there's constant changes in these communities as well. Things like fire, things like natural disasters, all that kind of stuff can reset the clock and create this patchiness that gives a lot more diversity in the types of habitats that we're going to see. Now, primary succession occurs when an area where there's no community previously existing. This is where things like lichens or mosses are going to start kind of paving the way for this deciduous forest, a region which has a small and different soil climate than many of the different combinations of species. Now, all this research actually came out of my alma mater, University of Georgia. For whatever reason, they owned a huge property in Michigan that had been clear cut, and then they monitored the changes over time. Now, secondary succession occurs when the community has been disturbed but not destroyed. This is where fires, hurricanes, and agriculture are going to kind of tear through part of it, and then everything else is going to kind of recolonize, and it's going to give you that patchiness where you have some areas that are brand new looking, some areas that are old growth and have been there for hundreds of years. And ultimately, because of this patchiness, you have a much higher number of niches that are available and thus much higher diversity. The communities are going to continue to change their structure and composition over time because of the frequent disturbances. Few communities reach that climax condition in which diversity and composition are stable. So ultimately, that climax condition doesn't ever last forever, and the ecosystems are going to change. So I actually really hate the term climax because, yeah, it's the end of the line for now, but everything always changes. There's always a gradient. There's always a gray area to the pool when it comes to biology. All right. So, does anybody have any questions? As always, don't forget all of those typical things that are coming up. Quiz 12 is due on Sunday. Again, 2 more. Take advantage of it. Molecular biology is due on the 1st. Take advantage of it. Really easy. I know I had like 100 people not turn it in last time. That's 5% of your grade that's just gone. Also, don't cheat on it, please. If I catch you cheating, it's an automatic 0, and you probably will be turned for academic science. And finally, the final exam and the extra credit are coming up as well. Make sure you're on top of those things, and you'll do all right.